months have passed, the messages stopped. The routines changed. On the surface, life moved on. And yet, somewhere in the quiet moments, in the pauses between distractions, he still thinks about you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. This isn't nostalgia, it isn't weakness, and it isn't accidental. There are very specific psychological reasons why someone continues to think about a person long after they are gone. Not days, not weeks, months, sometimes years. Tonight, we're not talking about chasing. We're not talking about regret manipulation. We're talking about impact. Because when someone thinks about you long after your absence, it means something in them was changed, and change is never easily forgotten. You represented emotional safety, not excitement, and that is why your absence echoes longer than your presence ever needed to. Excitement is loud. It announces itself. It demands attention, thrives on novelty, and fades as quickly as it appears. Emotional safety, however, enters quietly. It does not insist on being noticed, yet it reshapes the inner world of the person who experiences it. When you were there, you were not trying to impress, entertain, or constantly stimulate. You were simply available, and that availability became a refuge in a world that rarely slows down enough to breathe. In everyday life, most people live with a background tension they barely recognize. They carry expectations, responsibilities, self-doubt, and the unspoken pressure to be enough. In relationships, this tension often intensifies. People perform roles, anticipate reactions, and guard their vulnerabilities. With you, something softened. The nervous system learned that it did not need to stay alert. Conversations did not feel like tests. Silence did not feel like failure. There was permission to exist without explanation, and that permission is more intoxicating than excitement because it touches a deeper human need, the need to feel safe while being fully oneself. Think of the moments that mattered most. They were probably not grand gestures or dramatic scenes. They were small, almost forgettable instances on the surface, sitting together without needing to fill the space, talking late into the night about ordinary things, sharing a worry without immediately trying to solve it, laughing at something trivial. These moments registered not as memories, but as states of being. The body remembers these states long after the mind has moved on, because the body keeps a record of where it felt regulated and at ease. Modern psychology often speaks about attachment and regulation, but long before theories existed, humans understood this instinctively. We are drawn to those who help our inner world settle. When someone provides emotional safety, they become associated with relief. Over time, relief becomes a reference point. When stress increases, when life becomes unpredictable, the mind unconsciously returns to the place where tension once dissolved. That is why, months later, thoughts of you arise not during moments of excitement, but during moments of fatigue, confusion, or quiet reflection. You did not demand energy. You did not drain. You did not create chaos that required recovery afterward. Instead, being with you felt like exhaling after holding one's breath for too long. Many people confuse intensity with depth, but intensity often overwhelms the system. Depth calms it. You offered depth. You offered steadiness. And steadiness creates trust at a level that words cannot reach. There is also something profoundly disarming about someone who does not need to be extraordinary to be present. You did not turn every interaction into a performance. You were not constantly proving your worth or seeking validation. This allowed the other person to stop performing as well. When two people drop their masks, even briefly, a rare kind of connection forms. In those moments, defense is lower, and the psyche experiences a taste of authenticity. Once tasted, authenticity cannot be forgotten. In real life, people often leave relationships that were exciting because excitement alone cannot sustain the weight of everyday existence. But people carry emotional safety with them. They compare new experiences against it, often without realizing why something feels off. A new relationship may be thrilling, passionate, and full of promise, yet something feels missing. That missing element is not you as a person, but the inner state you helped create. And because inner states are deeply personal, they are not easily replaced. There is a subtle grief that follows the loss of emotional safety. It is not the dramatic grief of heartbreak. It is quieter, more internal. It shows up as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or a sense that something essential has been misplaced. The person may not consciously label this as missing you, but the psyche knows. It recognizes that something stabilizing has been removed, and it searches for it again and again. Your power was never in holding on tightly. It was in offering consistency without control. You did not make love conditional on mood or circumstance. You were emotionally predictable in the best sense of the word. Predictability does not mean boredom. It means reliability. It means knowing that vulnerability will not be used as a weapon and that honesty will not be punished. For many people, this is an unfamiliar experience. When they encounter it, it leaves an imprint that time cannot easily erase. Even conflict, when emotional safety exists, feels different. Disagreements do not threaten the bond, they exist within it. If there were moments of tension between you, they likely resolved without humiliation or fear. That alone teaches the psyche that connection does not have to disappear when discomfort arises. This lesson is transformative because it challenges deeply ingrained beliefs formed long before the relationship began. As time passes, memories blur, details fade, and life continues. Yet the internal contrast remains. Emotional safety becomes the silent standard against which future connections are measured. And when that standard is not met, the mind returns to its origin, not to relive the past, but to understand the present. Thoughts of you become a question rather than a longing. Why did it feel different? Why did it feel easier? Why did it feel like home? You were not unforgettable because you created constant excitement. You were unforgettable because you allowed someone to rest in your presence. In a world addicted to stimulation, rest is revolutionary. It heals what excitement only distracts from, and healing, once experienced, is remembered long after the source is gone. That is why your absence is felt not as emptiness, but as a subtle imbalance. Something once aligned is now slightly off. And until that inner balance is restored, your memory continues to surface, not as noise, but as a quiet reminder of what emotional safety feels like and how rare it truly is. You saw him as he was, not as he pretended to be, and that is a far more unsettling and transformative experience than being admired for a carefully constructed image. Most people move through life armored, not because they want to deceive, but because they learned early that acceptance often comes with conditions. So they polish certain traits, hide others, and present a version of themselves that feels safer to offer to the world. Over time, the mask becomes familiar, even comfortable, and they forget how heavy it truly is, until someone looks at them and does not ask for the performance. When you met him, you did not immediately try to define him, fix him, or elevate him into something impressive. You listened in a way that did not rush to conclusions. You noticed the inconsistencies, the pauses, the contradictions, and you did not flinch. That alone communicated something powerful, that his worth was not dependent on coherence or perfection. Being seen in this way can feel both relieving and terrifying because it removes the usual escape routes. There is nowhere to hide, but also nowhere to prove. There may have been a moment, subtle and easily missed, when the shift occurred. Perhaps it was during a conversation that went deeper than intended, when he admitted something he rarely speaks aloud. Maybe it was a confession wrapped in humor, or a quiet acknowledgement of fear, doubt, or regret. In that moment, he was not testing you, he was bracing himself. Most people, when faced with such vulnerability, either minimize it, rush to reassure, or unconsciously pull away. You did something different. You stayed present. You did not rush him back into strength. You allowed him to exist in that exposed space without interruption. That experience leaves a mark because it contradicts a long-held belief that being fully seen leads to rejection. When that belief is challenged, the psyche is forced to reorganize. A new possibility emerges, the idea that authenticity might not be a liability after all. This realization does not always feel pleasant at first. It can be destabilizing, even uncomfortable, because it calls into question the strategies that once ensured emotional survival. If the mask is no longer necessary, what else has been built around it? In everyday life, people rarely encounter someone who can hold their complexity without simplifying it. They are praised for strengths, criticized for weaknesses, and categorized into convenient narratives. You did not reduce him to a role. You noticed his strengths without idealizing them and his flaws without condemning them. This balanced perception is rare, and it invites self-reflection. When someone realizes they are being seen accurately, they begin to see themselves more accurately as well. There is a reason this kind of connection lingers long after it ends. Being truly seen awakens parts of the self that were dormant, It brings to light unresolved conflicts, unacknowledged desires, and suppressed emotions. These elements do not disappear when the relationship does. They remain active, asking to be integrated. Thoughts of you resurface not because he is longing for the past, but because the encounter with you initiated an internal process that is still unfolding. You may not have realized it at the time, but by seeing him as he was, you offered him a mirror. Not a distorted one that flatters or criticizes, but a clear one that reflects without judgment. Looking into such a mirror can be unsettling. It strips away excuses and illusions. Yet it also offers something profoundly grounding, the chance to align with one's true self rather than an image. Consider how rare it is to feel accepted without being idealized. Idealization places pressure on the relationship. It demands consistency with an unrealistic standard. Acceptance, on the other hand, allows for movement and growth. When you accepted him as he was, you did not freeze him in time. You implicitly acknowledged his capacity to change, not because he was inadequate, but because he was human. This subtle distinction matters deeply. It shifts growth from obligation to possibility. In the months that follow separation, this experience often returns in unexpected ways. A comment from someone else feels superficial. A disagreement feels unsafe. A moment of vulnerability is met with discomfort rather than understanding. In these moments, the contrast becomes clear. He may not consciously think, "This is why I miss her," but his inner world recognizes the absence of that rare form of recognition you once offered. Stories from therapy rooms and personal reflections alike reveal a common theme. People do not forget those who saw them clearly during a formative period of their lives. Such encounters become reference points. They mark a before and an after. Before, the self was fragmented, divided between what was shown and what was hidden. After, the self has been glimpsed as a whole, even if only briefly. That glimpse cannot be unseen. You did not demand honesty, you invited it through your presence. You did not force vulnerability, you made it safe. And safety allows truth to emerge organically. This is why the memory of you carries weight. It is tied not to fantasy, but to reality. Not to who he wished to be, but to who he actually was in that moment. When someone is seen without pretense, it can awaken a longing not for the person who saw them, but for the state of authenticity that was possible in that space. You became associated with that state. Over time, as life continues and distractions multiply, the longing may soften, but the imprint remains. It shows up as introspection, as a quieter self-awareness, as an internal question that refuses to disappear. Why did it feel easier to be myself then? You did not just witness him. You validated his existence beyond performance. And that validation does not fade with distance. It becomes part of his internal landscape, shaping how he relates to himself and others. That is why your presence is remembered not with dramatic longing, but with a deep, reflective significance. You saw him as he was, and in doing so, you gave him a glimpse of a self he cannot forget. You left without destroying your dignity, and that quiet decision carried more weight than any dramatic goodbye ever could. In moments of separation, many people believe that intensity proves depth, that tears, accusations, or desperate attempts to hold on somehow validate the importance of what was shared. But dignity moves differently. It does not shout. It does not demand recognition. It simply remains intact, even when everything else is falling apart. When you chose to leave without unraveling yourself, you disrupted an expectation that runs deep in human psychology. Most people unconsciously anticipate chaos at the end of a meaningful connection. They expect anger, bargaining, or emotional collapse. These reactions, while understandable, provide closure of a certain kind. They create a narrative that explains the ending and allows the mind to compartmentalize the experience. You denied that narrative. By leaving with composure, you left a space where noise was expected. And in that silence, reflection began. Your restraint did not mean you felt less. It meant you respected your inner life enough not to turn pain into spectacle. There is a profound strength in refusing to use suffering as a currency for attention. When someone witnesses that strength, it unsettles them. They are forced to confront a loss without the distraction of drama. There is no emotional debris to step over, no easy justification to cling to, only the absence, clean and unresolved. In everyday life, dignity is often misunderstood as emotional distance or coldness. In truth, it is the ability to remain aligned with oneself under pressure. You did not abandon your values when you were hurt. You did not weaponize vulnerability or seek power through guilt. You chose coherence over chaos. That choice communicates self-worth at a level words cannot reach. It says, without saying, that your identity is not dependent on being chosen or validated by another. Psychologically, this creates a powerful imprint. When someone expects to be pursued and is not, the mind begins to ask questions, not accusatory ones, but introspective ones. Why did she not fight? Why did she not beg? Why did she walk away with her sense of self intact? These questions linger because they point inward rather than outward. They shift the focus from your behavior to their own assumptions. Your absence became a mirror. In the quiet aftermath, there was room to notice what had been taken for granted. Not because you demanded recognition, but because you removed yourself from the dynamic that sustained familiarity. Dignified departure does not force regret, it invites awareness. And awareness, once sparked, does not easily extinguish. There is also something deeply human about respecting what does not need to prove itself. When you left without dismantling yourself, you communicated that the relationship mattered, but not at the cost of your integrity. That balance is rare. Many people confuse self-respect with indifference, but they are not the same. Indifference disconnects. Self-respect remains emotionally honest while refusing self-betrayal. That distinction is felt, even if it is not consciously articulated. Over time, memories of conflict soften, but impressions of character endure. He may forget specific arguments or conversations, but he will remember how you handled the ending. Character reveals itself most clearly under stress. By choosing dignity, you revealed something stable and grounded about yourself. That stability becomes a reference point. When future relationships unravel in predictable ways, the contrast becomes apparent. Loud endings fade, quiet strength remains. Your choice also disrupted a common psychological defense. Many people cope with loss by reframing the other person as weak, desperate, or unstable. This narrative protects the ego. You offered no such escape. Your composure made it difficult to diminish you in order to feel better about the separation. Without that defense, the mind must sit with complexity, and complexity keeps the memory alive. There is an often overlooked aspect of dignified departure. It preserves the truth of what was shared. When endings turn cruel or chaotic, they contaminate the memory of the entire relationship. When you left with respect, you protected not only yourself, but the reality of what once existed. That protection carries a subtle power. It allows reflection without bitterness and remembrance without distortion. In the months that follow, this kind of ending continues to work quietly. It shows up in moments of comparison, when someone else reacts with volatility. It appears in moments of conflict, when emotional control feels absent. Without trying to teach a lesson, you became one. Not through words, but through example. And lessons learned through observation penetrate deeper than those imposed through confrontation. You did not need to announce your worth. You embodied it. You did not argue your value. You demonstrated it through restraint. This is why your absence feels different. It is not filled with unresolved anger or emotional noise. It is clean, and cleanliness leaves room for thought. Thought leads to insight, and insight reshapes memory. Leaving with dignity does not guarantee reconciliation, nor does it seek it. Its power lies elsewhere. It allows the person who left to remain whole, and the person who stayed behind to face the ending without distraction. That confrontation with reality is often delayed, but it is inevitable. When it arrives, it carries with it the image of someone who knew when to step away without losing themselves. You may never be thanked for this choice. You may never be acknowledged for the restraint it required. But its impact unfolds quietly over time. Long after emotions have settled, what remains is the impression of someone who honored themselves even in loss. That impression does not fade easily. It lingers, not as regret alone, but as respect. And respect, once earned, endures far longer than any dramatic farewell ever could. You challenged him without trying to change him, and that quiet paradox is what made your presence so powerful and so difficult to forget. Most people believe that challenge must be loud, corrective, or forceful. They think growth happens when someone is pushed, pressured, or reshaped by another's expectations. But the kind of challenge you represented did not come from confrontation. It came from contrast. You did not stand in front of him demanding transformation. You stood beside him, living in alignment with yourself, and that alone disrupted his inner equilibrium. In everyday relationships, people often mistake control for care. They correct habits, point out flaws, and offer unsolicited advice, believing that improvement is an act of love. Yet this approach usually triggers resistance. The psyche closes in on itself when it feels manipulated or evaluated. You did the opposite. You allowed him to be who he was without interference, and in doing so, you exposed the difference between his current self and his potential self. That difference is not imposed, it is perceived, and what is perceived voluntarily penetrates far deeper than what is enforced. There were moments when your boundaries spoke louder than words. You did not explain yourself excessively or justify your needs. You did not shrink to maintain harmony, nor did you escalate to assert dominance. You simply remained consistent with your values. When something did not align, you did not argue endlessly, you adjusted your presence. This subtle firmness communicated self-respect, and self-respect naturally invites reflection in those who witness it. Challenging someone without trying to change them creates a mirror rather than a battlefield. A battlefield demands defense. A mirror invites awareness. In your presence, he was not under attack, but he could not escape himself either. He noticed the ways you handled conflict, how you spoke about responsibility, how you navigated discomfort without self-betrayal. None of this was directed at him, yet all of it reached him. It planted questions rather than accusations, and questions, once planted, continue to grow in the mind long after the person who inspired them has gone. Psychologically, this kind of influence is deeply unsettling because it bypasses ego defenses. When someone tries to change us, we can dismiss them as controlling or critical. When someone simply lives differently, we cannot dismiss the comparison so easily. You did not tell him he needed to grow. You demonstrated what growth looked like, and demonstration leaves no room for argument. There may have been times when he felt inexplicably uncomfortable around you, even when nothing was wrong. That discomfort was not caused by judgment, it was caused by awareness. Your presence illuminated areas of stagnation he had learned to ignore. Not through shame, but through contrast, you showed, without saying, that it was possible to choose integrity over convenience, reflection over avoidance, and accountability over excuse. Such realizations rarely feel pleasant at first. They create internal tension, a quiet pressure to reconcile who one is with who one could be. In real life, people often resist those who push them, but they are haunted by those who awaken them. Awakening does not feel like encouragement. It feels like exposure. And exposure, when not forced, carries a strange authority. You did not strip him of his defenses, you made them unnecessary. In that space, he glimpsed a version of himself that required no justification, no rationalization, only honesty. This is why your influence did not end when the relationship did. The challenge you embodied was not situational, it was internal. It did not depend on your presence to continue. Once the seed of awareness is planted, it grows independently. Months later, in moments of choice or conflict, your example reappears. Not as a voice telling him what to do, but as a silent standard against which decisions are measured. You did not offer ultimatums. You did not threaten departure to induce change. When you eventually stepped back or walked away, it was not framed as punishment. It was a natural consequence of misalignment. That distinction matters deeply. Punishment provokes resentment. Consequence invites understanding. By choosing consequence over coercion, you preserve both your dignity and his autonomy. And autonomy is the soil in which genuine growth takes root. There is a profound respect that emerges when someone realizes they were never forced to change, yet they were undeniably changed. It dismantles the illusion that growth only occurs under pressure. It reveals a more unsettling truth, that growth begins when we encounter a living example of what we are not yet ready to become. That encounter cannot be undone. It lingers in the background, shaping perception and influencing behavior long after the relationship ends. You challenged him by being whole, by not needing him to complete you or validate your choices, by not compromising your inner alignment to secure external approval. This kind of wholeness is confronting because it removes excuses. It shows that strength does not require control and that love does not require self-erasure. For someone still negotiating their own identity, witnessing this can feel both inspiring and destabilizing. Over time, the memory of you becomes less about shared moments and more about internal shifts. He may forget the details of conversations, but he remembers how he felt around you, slightly more aware, slightly more responsible, slightly more called to account, not by your words but by your presence. That sensation does not fade easily because it is tied to growth, and growth reshapes the inner landscape permanently. You did not try to change him, yet you made change unavoidable. Not because you demanded it, but because you embodied something that could not be ignored. And that is the quiet power of authentic challenge. It does not seek to control outcomes. It trusts that exposure to truth, once experienced, will continue its work in silence, long after the source has stepped away. You triggered growth, and growth is painful, not because pain is the goal, but because growth demands the dismantling of what once kept us comfortable. Most people believe pain comes from loss, rejection, or failure. In truth, the deeper pain comes from awareness, from realizing that something within us can no longer remain the same. When you entered his life, you did not simply add affection or companionship. You introduced contrast, and contrast is the beginning of growth. Before you, certain patterns felt normal. Avoidance felt justified. Emotional distance felt safe. Stagnation felt manageable because it was familiar. You did not arrive announcing change or insisting on evolution. You arrived as yourself, living with a level of presence, reflection, and emotional honesty that quietly exposed what had been left undeveloped. Growth does not begin when someone is told they are lacking. It begins when they encounter a version of life that makes their current state feel insufficient. Pain emerges when the psyche realizes that what once worked no longer does. Your presence destabilized old coping mechanisms. He could no longer rely on charm alone, or distraction, or emotional withdrawal, because those strategies lost their effectiveness around you, not because you confronted them, but because you did not need them. You showed, without instruction, that connection could exist without avoidance, that intimacy did not require control, and that emotional responsibility did not destroy freedom. These realizations are not comforting at first. They create friction between who a person is and who they sense they could become. Growth often begins with irritation, a subtle discomfort that something is off. He may not have understood why he felt restless, defensive, or unsettled around you at times. That discomfort was not caused by incompatibility. It was caused by expansion. When inner structures are asked to stretch beyond their limits, resistance appears. The ego clings to what it knows because familiarity feels like safety. But the deeper self recognizes the call to evolve, even when it hurts. You became associated with that call, not because you demanded better behavior, but because your existence highlighted what was undeveloped. This is why growth feels like loss before it feels like progress. To grow, one must grieve old identities. The version of himself that avoided accountability. The comfort of not questioning patterns. The safety of emotional numbness. Being with you made it harder to remain unconscious of these things. And consciousness, once awakened, is irreversible. In real life, people often mistake growth pain for relational failure. They think the discomfort means the connection is wrong. In reality, the discomfort often means the connection is honest. You did not create chaos, you created clarity. And clarity strips away illusion. Illusion is soothing. Clarity is demanding. It requires choice, responsibility, and courage. Not everyone is ready for that when it arrives. There may have been moments when he felt inexplicably overwhelmed, even when nothing dramatic was happening. Moments when he pulled back, shut down, or sought distance. That withdrawal was not indifference. It was the psyche attempting to regulate itself under pressure. Growth activates fear because it threatens identity. Who am I if I change? What do I lose if I let go of old defenses? What if I fail to become what this moment asks of me? Your role was not to answer those questions. Your role was to awaken them. And awakening is disruptive. It does not feel like motivation. It feels like exposure. Exposure to limitations. Exposure to unresolved wounds. Exposure to the cost of remaining the same. This is why, after separation, thoughts of you continue to surface. Not because he misses the relationship alone, but because the process you initiated did not end when you left. Growth pain does not resolve itself quickly. It lingers, resurfaces, and reshapes perspective over time. Months later, when life returns to familiar patterns, something feels hollow. Old habits no longer provide the same comfort. Distractions feel thin. Relationships feel less alive. This is not nostalgia. It is integration. The psyche is attempting to reconcile the awareness you triggered with the life that followed. People often remember those who made them feel good, but they never forget those who made them grow. Growth rewires perception. Once someone has seen themselves more clearly, they cannot return fully to unconsciousness, even if they try, even if they resist, even if they distract themselves. Your presence created a before and after, and that division marks significance far deeper than pleasure ever could. There is also grief embedded in growth. Grief for the time wasted. Grief for opportunities missed. Grief for the realization that change was always possible, but postponed. That grief is painful because it removes the comfort of excuses. You did not accuse him of stagnation. You simply existed in a way that made stagnation visible. And visibility creates accountability, even when no one demands it. You may never witness the outcome of the growth you triggered. Growth rarely unfolds on the timeline of connection. Often, it begins only after separation, when the external stimulus is gone and the internal work can no longer be avoided. In solitude, the questions you awaken grow louder. What am I doing with my life? Why do I repeat the same patterns? What am I afraid to confront? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are fertile. They lead to transformation, even when resisted. This is why growth feels like pain rather than reward. Reward comes later. Pain comes first. The pain of shedding identities that once protected but now limit. The pain of recognizing that comfort and fulfillment are not the same. The pain of choosing responsibility over avoidance. You became linked to this internal reckoning, not because you caused suffering, but because you disrupted numbness. Your impact was not in staying. It was in initiating movement. Movement away from stagnation. Movement towards self-awareness. Movement toward a more integrated self. Even if he fought that movement. Even if he delayed it. Even if he resented it at times. Growth does not ask for permission. Once triggered, it continues its work quietly, persistently, reshaping the inner world long after the outer connection has ended. You triggered growth, and growth is painful because it demands honesty. But honesty, once introduced, does not disappear. It waits, it matures, and eventually, it transforms. If he still thinks about you months later, it's not because you stayed in his life. It's because you stayed in his psyche. You didn't force a memory. You created a shift. And shifts don't disappear, they integrate. So don't confuse silence with insignificance. Don't mistake distance for forgetting. Some people don't haunt us because we lost them. They haunt us because they showed us something we can never unlearn. And that is a legacy no time can erase.